Well, hello class. Welcome to Chapter 12, Personality Psychology. I'm so excited about this chapter. I've been looking forward to this for several weeks now. My background is in social and personality psychology, and so this is kind of my area. I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about the foundations of this subfield within psychology, and hopefully by the end of the lecture, you're going to know a little bit more about yourself and others, as well as the scientific approach to studying personality. Well, as always, you want to be thinking about your own affect, behavior, and cognition, or your personality characteristics. Who are you? What are the strengths that you have? And what are some of the weaknesses? You know, those strengths and weaknesses are unique to you. They're part of who you are, and who you are is still growing and still learning and still yet to have many adventures. So let's put our growth mindset on and let's turn on intrapersonal knowledge or self-insight as we learn a little bit about the basics of human psychology. Personality refers to the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in certain ways. Our personality is what makes us unique and special. Each person has an idiosyncratic pattern of enduring long-term characteristics, and also a manner in which he or she interacts with other individuals and the world around them. Our personalities are thought to be a long-term, stable, and not easily changed facet of who we are. The word personality comes from a Latin word persona, and that word persona is a mask. So in the ancient world, a persona would be like a mask that an actor would wear on a stage. While we tend to think of a mask being worn to conceal our identity, in that theatrical tradition, the mask was used to display the personality characteristics and the emotions and the intent of the character that was on the stage. In this chapter, we're going to walk through the persona, or your personality. And you'll see that many different traditions in medicine, biology, in psychology, in psychiatry, in clinical traditions, different facets of social science and science in general have walked through this question of what is human personality? How does it form? How do we measure it? What do we do with it? In this chapter, you're going to walk through the different traditions. We have the psychodynamic tradition, the humanistic tradition, the trait perspective, the personological perspectives, the big perspective of social cognitive or behavioral theories, as well as biological perspectives. And by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about how we assess human personality. All right, let's get started. So let's start with the general understanding of what personality is. Personality essentially, you guys, is a suite or constellation of affect, behavioral, and cognitive patterns that are consistently displayed by you across situations. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the same in every situation. It just means that your rank order on that characteristic relatively stays the same. So it's not saying that if you're outgoing in every setting. It just means that more than the non-outgoing people, an outgoing person is, on average, across situations, going to be more outgoing. So this characteristic pattern has to do with ABCs: affect, behavior, and cognition. So you think of yourself as having these multiple pieces to who you are: your feelings, your behaviors, and your thoughts. And that distinctive and enduring and coherent narrative of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, they characterize you and how you interact with the world. That is personality. It is a pattern of enduring, distinctive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, or affect, behavior, and cognition, that characterize a way an individual interacts with the world. It is the coherent and relatively stable way that you engage with yourself and others, how you are motivated internally, how you're motivated externally, how you engage in social interactions, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what your needs are, what your desires are, what your goals are intrapersonally and interpersonally. It has to do with your affective style or your feelings and emotions. It has to do with how you engage and how you interact or adapt with a social world around you, as well as how you behave in that world. Do you engage with it? Are you assertive in it? Or do you let just things roll by? So I want you thinking about your characteristics. I want you thinking about your emotional life and your behavioral interactions and the way that you think. Because the unique combination of that affect, behavior, and cognition makes up you. All right, let's start with our first perspective, the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective. We owe this psychodynamic perspective to Sigmund Freud. And you've probably heard of Freud before. In order to understand this theory and really have the heart for it that I want you to have, or an understanding of it, you have to understand a little bit about the context of this theory. You have to understand what it was like at the time that this theory was developed, who Freud was, what the social pressures of the day were, what the context was overall. Having an idea for some of those things, I think, is going to help you put it into perspective or put it in a more reasonable light. Freud was born in 1856 in what is essentially the Czech Republic. Around age 3, his family, of Jewish descent, moved to Vienna, Austria. In his life, he's going to navigate a Victorian era and essentially the Nazi rise to power. He is, at the tail end of his life, going to have to flee to London because of World War. He's going to be a man that is part of a society that values men more than women. This Victorian society is going to be very prudish when it comes to discussions of pleasure and sex and intimacy. In fact, the prohibitions are going to be so extreme for women that it's going to be sort of assumed that married women have sex with their husbands only for the sake of having kids. So not only were women sort of denied general rights as humans at this time, but they were also denied the privilege and pleasure of having sex or enjoying it. You're going to see strong prohibitions about sexual behavior, sexual pleasure, and sexual discussion. This same society is going to expect that married women have sex only for child-rearing purposes, but the men are thought to have sort of a free pass. So oftentimes in this society, what would happen is a man would marry a woman, and with that woman, he would have kids with that woman. So he would have sex with her not for pleasure, but for child rearing. And since men were given a pass at this time, it was often allowed or permitted that a man would have a mistress, and he would have some sexual fun or sexual pleasure with the mistress, keeping his wife and her virtue intact. When you also take those prohibitions and the rise of Nazi Germany at essentially this zeitgeist or this time in society, it's no surprise that some of these ideas, as provocative as they are, some of these ideas are birthed in that season. So I really want you to have some compassion or some perspective for the time, date, and place in which these ideas are coming about. So let's talk about the psychodynamic perspective. So Freud at this time in Vienna, he ends up being trained as a neurologist. So he's a medical doctor. And he doesn't set out to sort of change psychology for all time. He just basically is a medical doctor that is treating a lot of female patients. And these female patients are coming in to his practice with something called hysteria. Hysteria essentially is that they are experiencing psychosomatic symptoms, that they're having physical symptoms with no physical cause. So like a numb leg or a numb arm, and there's no physical organ damage. There's no physical reason for it. As a neurologist, he would get patients like this. And so he's getting a lot of women that are coming in with physical complaints that he can't find any physical cause for as a medical doctor. And what he finds in his practice, almost accidentally, is that talking to these women and allowing them to talk and share makes their physical symptoms better. This is where we get the idea of free association. And this is the beginning of psychiatry and clinical practice, essentially, as we know it in the modern world. You'll think of the psychiatrist and you'll think of the patient on the couch facing the other way, just sort of discussing their life. And that's what he would do. He'd have these women come in, they would sort of recline and get comfortable on a couch. He would be facing the other way so that they could talk freely. And as they talk through their issues, this talking therapy was actually helping their physical maladies. So within this context and within this client base, Freud starts to develop his ideas of human personality. Freud starts to develop the idea that the mind is not fully conscious, that who you are is not fully accessible to you. You have preconscious, conscious, and unconscious. And the only way to kind of access those unconscious places is through symbolic interactions with stuff like dreaming, dream interpretation, or free association, where you're just kind of letting yourself just kind of unfold and be truthful and expressed. To Freud, personality is going to be essentially unconscious. It's going to be unavailable to our conscious awareness. And yet, this unconscious place is going to have a large ability to shape our behaviors, our thoughts, and our feelings. Freud thought that a large part of who you are is unconscious. You can't comprehend it. You can't access it. You can't have conscious, available awareness of it. Because some of those places are too complicated, too deep, and too dark for you to be able to handle. To Freud, the way we handle those deep, dark places is through exploring the symbolic meanings of your behavior. That despite some of those dark things and deep things being under your conscious awareness, they still have a huge influence on your day-to-day life. You just don't have the ability to understand it. So psychoanalysis is the process of unraveling some of those symbolic meanings and deep places as a way of understanding human behavior, human feelings, and thought processes. There's many things that people will criticize Freud for, and we will get to them. But one of the ideas that has great empirical use and research use to us even now, it's a new idea. It's an idea that was not really there at the time, and that is the idea of the unconscious. You do have places in your sensory perceptual system that take in information but are not aware of it all at the same time. That is actually quite true. There are places in who you are that are not fully aware of what you're comprehending every second of the day. So we need to give him credit for that big idea, the idea of the unconscious. We also want to give him credit for the fact that at a time when kids were not even researched or given a lot of respect or thought at all, he was talking about how early childhood influences can sculpt and influence later experiences. Even that idea was provocative at the time. Now, if you have this mind that has these layers to its levels of awareness, from being conscious and alert to being unaware, what do you do with that? And what resides in the unconscious? Well, to Freud, and it's not a surprise given the context that he was living in at the time, to Freud, essentially, those unconscious places had to do with a sex drive. Now, sex in the way that he's talking about it is not just intercourse. Sex is more used as like pleasure, like physical pleasure. So if you think about it, the sex drive is like a physical drive. It's a drive for physical pleasure. And he thought that that sex drive was a main determinant of personality and behavior. And as a person has this unconscious sex drive, but they have conflicts with a world that's civilized and a world that's Victorian, a world that has all these prohibitions, but they also have this deeper place that wants pleasure, wants connection, and wants to feel good, there's a conflict and a war between those places. So that conflict between the civilized and the deeply desirous places was a main determinant of how you came to be who you were. That conflict is where your personality was formed. And that conflict would explain a lot of your behaviors, your issues, your affect behaviors and cognitions. So as I mentioned before, the big principle here for Freud, as no surprise given the context of society and the context of his life, was that there was this sex drive, this pleasure drive that a person had. And it was a main determinant of personality development and behavioral display. We know that because of the context of society at the time, these ideas were totally provocative. And they're about to get even more provocative, because Freud is going to say that these drives, they're in existence even at birth, and little kids have these drives, these deep drives for pleasure. It's going to be a huge idea. It was shocking to even discuss it. Here you have this doctor from Vienna is saying that who a person becomes to be has something to do with how they navigate these deep, dark sexual impulses underneath their conscious awareness. And they're not even aware that they have these drives, that the only way you can access those things is by free association or dream interpretation or looking for the symbolic meanings in their behavior to understand where these actions and feelings and thoughts are coming from. And what lends some credibility to Freud at this point is that his clients, his female clients with hysteria, are being cured by this talking therapy. So essentially at the heart of this talking cure, as he called it, the women would talk about their lives, and sometimes their unconscious and these deep areas, these multiple deep areas, would slip. And then he would have some insight on where some of those places would be. Like maybe a client would call him Dad instead of Sigmund, or Doctor. Thank you so much, Dad. I mean, Doctor. And from that, he'd be like, oh, tell me about your father. Tell me about your relationship with your father. Tell me about your feelings with your father. That at times these dark and deeper places, they don't stay there forever. They want to be expressed and they need to be expressed. They just don't have the channel to do so in a society that is that rigid. So let's talk about the 3 parts of personality structure according to Freud. According to Freud, the personality is going to have 3 different structures: id, ego, and superego. Now the id, that term id means it, and the id is going to be operating on instinct and basic impulse and deep drives, those deep sex drives, those pleasure drives. It's operating on the pleasure principle. I want it. It feels good. Now, now, now. It is all drive, no check, no balance, no boundary. It has no contact with reality. It is all self-satisfying. According to Freud, the id or it is completely unconscious. It resides completely in the unconscious. It tells the person, we want that, do it now. The second part of human personality, according to Freud, is the ego or the self. Ego means I. Essentially, this is the person, and it operates on something called the reality principle. It's partly conscious and partly unconscious, and essentially it exists to deal with the demands of what's really going on currently in the current reality. So it's going to be involved in stuff like decision making, reasoning, and being able to navigate the real world. Now, if the id tells you do it and do it now, the ego says, okay, hold up. We want to do it, but only if you're not going to get punished for it, or only if you don't get caught. Like, we want to do it, but let's think for a second about how we can do it without being consequenced. Let's be realistic here. If I grab that cookie, my mom's going to give me a spanking, so I'll just wait for her to walk out of the room. And the final part of human personality, according to Freud, is the superego, or above self, or above I. This is a partly conscious place that you have, and it's essentially your conscience. This is your moral bearing. It's the very last part of personality to develop, according to Freud. Now, the goal of the superego is to suppress the id. So the superego and the id are at war with one another, outright war. The id says, do it right now, and the superego says, don't do it at all. Don't even think about it. So the superego is really operating on like the moral principle, what the parent says, what the authority says, what society says. And all three parts of who you are here, you can see there's a constant negotiation and conflict between the parts. Many cartoons will often have a cartoon character that is dealing with some sort of decision or having to make a decision. And you'll see the cartoon character has on one shoulder, it's like a little devil, and on the other shoulder, a little angel. Well, that's like the perfect example of id, ego, and superego. Let's imagine Donald Duck is having one of those moments, because you know Donald, he has some issues with emotional regulation, right? So let's say for a moment, Donald's trying to decide to do something. Donald himself would be the ego. That's the reality principle. That's what's really going on. The little devil Donald that's on his left shoulder that has the pitchfork and the red cape, that is the id. That's the pleasure principle. Do it, Donald. You want it. Go for it. And then on the right shoulder, you have the little halo and harp and little winged Donald, where he's a little angel Donald. And he's saying, don't do that, Donald. You don't want to do that. Good ducks don't do that. So Freud is going to say that this war rages within a person as the id says, do it and do it now. And the ego says, hey, let's do it if we can, if it's not going to cost us something. And the superego says, don't even think about it. Don't do it at all. Don't, it's bad that you're even thinking about it. These three parts to who you are, they are at war with one another. They're at conflict with one another. They're taking resources from you. Freud would say that they have psychic energy. And he's not meaning psychic like you think psychic. He's meaning psyche. Like it's taking psychological energy for you to have this war raging for yourself. It's taking psychological energy to endure these conflicts. Now, because it's taking so much psychological energy to navigate these conflicts, you have to have some solutions to reduce all of the anxiety that's produced from the war between these three parts of your personality. You can imagine that war, especially between the id and the superego, creates tremendous anxiety for the ego in the middle. So in response to that war, the ego will create defense mechanisms. And those defenses are going to alter or distort or deny reality so that the person doesn't have to face the true conflict or the true horror of what's actually going on the deepest instinctual drive or id level. Now, when we talk about Freud's big ideas, or the big ideas that have lasted for Freud, we're going to see that the unconscious, the idea of the unconscious, is something that has lasted, but also his idea of defense mechanisms those things have also been very useful moving forward in understanding human psychology. His daughter, Anna Freud, actually is a large contributor of this work, so she should receive a lot of praise for the development of the idea as well. She took it farther and deeper than her dad started. So let's review defense mechanisms. As mentioned, you have an id and a superego, and they're at war with one another. That war creates anxiety for the ego, the in-between spot. That ego, since it's partially conscious and partially unconscious, is trying to navigate these two realms, and it's difficult and it doesn't feel good. That anxiety is not fun to deal with, so the ego has to create things that buffer, lessen, damper, or take away some of the anxiety. So the ego will reduce that anxiety of the conflict between the id and the superego by unconsciously distorting reality or altering reality in some way so the person doesn't have to feel so bad. Now, before you think that all defense mechanisms are really, really, really unhealthy, just remember that according to Freud, you do have some deep, deep, deep places of who you are that are really hard to face. So a defense mechanism that shields you from the full recognition of some of those places could actually be a very good coping strategy. It could be a practical way of navigating, dealing with some of the hard stuff, but not having the full awareness of the hard stuff. On a practical level, defense mechanisms allow you to not have to face the deep and dark and dragon-filled places of the underneath and the underbelly of who you are. And that's not necessarily unhealthy. You don't need to face all those places every day, all the time, right? Sometimes you have to go to work, sometimes you have to caregive, sometimes you have to do other things. So defense mechanisms are not necessarily unhealthy. Freud would say that when they're used exclusively or always, so it's not in moderation, it's not a little bit of self-reflection, a little bit of talking through, and a little bit of protecting yourself. But if you're using them all the time to extreme levels, that would be unhealthy. One of the most well-known defense mechanisms is the main one, and that is repression. So in repression, the ego takes an experience and locks it deep, deep, deep away in the unconscious. Repression is going to push all of those unacceptable impulses and memories and experiences and take them completely outside of awareness. And Freud says that repression is the foundation for all of the other defense mechanisms. Let's take a look at a metaphor of what we've been talking about. So in Freud's personality structure, we have the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the largest part of who you are, and it is the deepest down. It is the farthest underneath the waterline. Everything above the water you can see and you can access and you have conscious awareness of. So you can see it, you can feel it, you can interact with it, you can talk about it, you can understand it. Everything underneath the water is your unconscious. So you'll see that the id is completely unconscious. And the ego is partially unconscious and partially conscious. It navigates a little bit of both. It has connections with the deep places. It has connections with the conscious places. And the superego touches and interacts with both places. So in repression, according to Freud, what's happening is the ego that's navigating and trying to navigate reality and deal with the current demands of reality, it's going to acknowledge that there is an impulse, a memory, an internal issue that is so hard to face that it has to be sent down deep, deep into the unconscious. What the ego is trying to do there is trying to keep it outside of the superego's awareness, because the superego is going to feel bad about it, whatever that is. It wants to keep it outside of conscious awareness for sure, because conscious awareness is going to be aware of it and feel bad about it, right? So we've got to get it away from the superego, because the superego is going to moralize about it. It has to get out of conscious level, because that would be too hard to address, because if it's conscious, I'm thinking of it and processing it right now. I'm apprehending it. So the ego has to take this experience, this memory, or this mental issue and put it far, far underneath the waterline. The lower it is in the water, the less likely I am to see it. And that push down into the unconscious is repression. So let's walk through some defense mechanisms. And thank you very much, Anna Freud, for elaborating on these. We appreciate them. They actually are very useful in psychology. So thank you, Anna. You did a good job. So repression, as I mentioned, is the master defense mechanism. It has to do with pushing unacceptable impulses and memories far into the unconscious. Repression and denial are two very similar defense mechanisms, but repression has to do with something that is mental, internal, or memory-based. And that's the thing that's getting shoved deep into the unconscious. For denial, the thing that's getting pushed out of awareness is like an external issue or an external factor, like something that's happening at work or something that's stressful that's happening on the news. So a classic example of repression is something like a traumatic experience that a person has endured, and it's so terrible and so violent and so awful and so yucky that it has to be sent outside of memory and constant awareness, because the person can't handle all of it all the time. The psyche, or the psychology of a person, is putting energy into putting it out of sight, out of mind. The next defense mechanism is rationalization. And rationalization is when the ego takes a less acceptable motive and replaces it with a more acceptable one. In rationalization, what the ego is dealing with is that there have been desires that have been in one direction, but the reality or outcome has been something else. And so there is a war between what you wanted and what you got, or a war between how you behaved and how you should have behaved. And so you're having to essentially rationalize or make sense of these conflicting motives. So let's say, for example, that someone set you up on a blind date and you get all dressed up and you're ready for the date and you have all these expectations, and the person doesn't show up. So you've had this drive, you've had these ideas, you've had this motive, and then what's happened has been different than what the drive would determine. What rationalization does is it takes some of the pain away and makes sense of the difference there. So a person might say something like, you know what, I'm really good not in a relationship right now anyway. I really need to focus on my school. It's, hey, I was really busy, but I didn't really want a relationship right now anyway. Since all of us live in a world that has a lot of cognitive dissonance, a lot of differences between how we act, feel, and behave, we rationalize things a lot. Rationalization is a main thing that humans do when they try to make sense of their behavior in a social world. In displacement, the ego is going to shift our feelings towards an unacceptable motive or object or outcome or behavior into a more acceptable place to put those feelings. So in displacement, the ego is taking something that's not acceptable, an action and a feeling that is very clearly not acceptable, and taking that emotion and feeling place and displacing it into another object, person, location. So for example, if I'm super upset with something that happened at work, somebody said something, there was some conflict, there was some drama. If I come home and I slam my purse and my car keys down on the table, I have taken that conflict from work and displaced it to the kitchen table, to the table, right? It's not about my purse. It's not about my keys. It's about the thing that happened at work. And since at work it would be unacceptable for me to slam down my car keys and my purse or yell or tantrum or hit something, that would be inappropriate, highly unacceptable. I displace that energy to a place that can take it, or to a place that is more acceptable. Now, the difference between rationalization and displacement is that rationalization has to do with motive and has to do with less and more acceptable motives, whereas displacement has to do with unacceptable feelings and more acceptable places to put those feelings. They're both quite similar, but rationalization has more of an intellectual or thought process component to it. In sublimation, the ego is going to replace an unacceptable impulse or drive with a more socially appropriate one. So what might be an example of this? So let's use a classic Freudian psychosexual development example. Let's imagine that someone was weaned from breastfeeding too early. They wanted to receive that from their mom, and they were little and they didn't get it. And as an adult, they can't get that desire. They can't breastfeed anymore as an adult. So that person might sublimate. They might always have a hydro flask with them. They might always be drinking from a straw. They might always chew on their pens. Those are more socially acceptable outcomes to deal with that unacceptable drive or unresolved drive. And in that way, the person is going to transform the vile or the unacceptable into something that is valuable or better or more successful. So you might think of a comedian having a really hard childhood and then taking those really hard, yucky places and becoming funny and charming and using those places to make other people happy. Taking an unacceptable place and transforming it into something else. In the defense mechanism of projection, the ego is going to protect your pride, essentially. It's going to protect you from seeing some of your shortcomings and problems. And the way it's going to protect you from them is by placing them on someone else. So it's going to be your problem, but since it's too hard for you to acknowledge that that's your own problem, you're going to see it in other people. So if a person that you know is constantly bringing up that they think that other people are gossiping about them, or that person's so judgmental, and that person's so selfish, if this is coming up a lot for the same person, maybe that person is the one that's gossiping. Maybe that person is the one that's selfish. Maybe some of the things that they're complaining about others is just the projection of their own shortcoming being placed onto an external outside other person. If you're very quick to see faults in other people, this might tell you that your ego is trying to spare you a little bit. Maybe some of those faults are something that you're experiencing too. In reaction formation, what's really interesting here and what's happening is that the ego is taking your love for something and turning it into hate, or turning your hate into love. Freud would say that strong emotions are not linear. So imagine a ruler. Go ahead and imagine that you're holding a ruler, like a 12-inch ruler. Love is on one end and hate is on the other. See how far away they are? They're 12 inches away from one another. But to Freud, love and hate weren't actually that far away from one another. They're more like a bracelet. So you take that ruler and turn it into a bracelet that's barely connected. It's not even touching the two ends. The love and hate are not 12 inches apart. They're like less than an inch apart. And that's what's at play here with reaction formation. You're taking something strongly felt, especially when it's negative and unacceptable, and transforming it into the very opposite. Perhaps your friend that is the health food fanatic and constantly posts about food and eating healthy and constantly looks down on people that don't eat healthy. Perhaps that friend really has a desire to eat unhealthy, and it is such a strong desire that they have to run in the opposite direction to escape it. Reaction formation. Now remember, in repression, we were talking about repression takes an internal, mental, or experiential memory or issue and puts it deep underneath the surface. For denial, that issue is something that's external. It's part of the reality of what's happening right now. It's something that's producing anxiety in your realistic setting right now. And the ego is refusing to acknowledge that that thing that's producing anxiety exists. So whereas repression might be like a memory of a traumatic experience, denial might be something like a bad test score or the fact that you have a test coming up in a couple of weeks. For repression, that's like a memory and an experience. And for denial, you're dealing with an anxiety-producing reality. Something in the reality of your life you just want to forget about. So for example, today, when I'm recording this, I have students in another class that have papers due today, and I guarantee you that some of them denied that these papers were due, and they are probably freaking out right now because they're working on them and realizing that it's going to take more than a couple of hours to do. Denial's not very healthy, especially when it has to do with things that you can have some say in helping. So a test score or a doctor's visit or a hard conversation that you need to have. Denial often makes those things bigger than they need to be. That it actually would reduce anxiety if you just dealt with it right now rather than put it off for later. And last but not least, we have regression. In regression, the ego is going to seek out the security of an earlier time period in your life as a way of dealing with stress, conflict, or something hard. What you're regressing or going back to is an earlier or safer time. Have you ever heard someone say that they needed to just go lay down in the fetal position and go to bed? Well, that fetal position, right? You've got your pillows, you got your blankets, you're all wrapped up in a little cocoon. That is an earlier period, right? So in this slide, we see the work of the ego. The ego is trying to protect you. The ego is trying to stay present in the present reality and not feel anxious. And these defenses are a way for you to navigate your world and make it through some hard things. So what's a metaphor to sort of understand these? Well, imagine if these defense mechanisms were like painkillers or medicine. Medicine like Tylenol is not bad for you, but you wouldn't want to take Tylenol every hour, every day, all the time. Your liver and your body can't handle that. Even something good or useful or temporarily good cannot be good all the time, right? So what the nature of the talking cure, or what therapy is, psychoanalytic theory, is trying to get at the root of what's going on to alleviate and make sense of these deeper places in such a way as the ego, superego, and id can manage their relationships with one another. All right, we want to move on to the psychosexual stages according to Freud. And I know it's weird, you guys. It was way weirder when he was proposing these things in Vienna in the Victorian era, as you can imagine. But just remember, he's not meaning sex like intercourse per se. He's meaning sex as pleasure. So when he's saying sex drive, he's meaning the unconscious drive to have pleasure and have reward. According to Freud, There are different erogenous zones, zones of pleasure and strong pleasure at different stages of development. And each of these stages plays a role in the formation of personality development, such that if you have a problem or a fixation at a particular stage in development, your adult personality could be influenced by that difficulty with that particular fixated stage. That's going to make a little bit more sense in a little bit, but let's get started. In the first stage of psychosexual development, we have the oral stage. This is approximately from birth to 18 months old. And what Freud's going to say is that at birth, you have your id. And in this oral stage, you are largely just id. So babies want pleasure. They want to eat. They want to be held. They need their diaper changed. It's me, 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 very rightly so. And what Freud is saying is that the way that a baby gets pleasure and is able to meet their needs, essentially, is by putting things in their mouth. He calls it the oral stage because the main task in that stage is breastfeeding. Sucking on things, putting their hands in their mouth, chewing on things, biting down on things, a pacifier, a blanket, a toy. The mouth is a place where they're exploring the world and also releasing the tension that they experience. It feels good when you're eating and you're breastfeeding or you're receiving a bottle. That feels good, and that reduces tension. Now, according to Freud, if a person is weaned too early or too late, or the mom is withholding of the breast, or the mom breastfeeds too long, there's going to be an oral fixation. There's a fixation or a problem at this stage. What's the implication for adult personality here? Is someone that has an oral fixation will use food or talking or smoking or drinking or nail biting, overeating, undereating. They'll use things that have to do with their mouth as a way to reduce tension. And they will do that in response to that unresolved conflict from the oral stage. In the next stage of development, according to Freud, we have the anal stage, and this is approximately 18 to 36 months. The main task at this stage has to do with toilet training. In this stage, the ego is going to start to develop. In this age, kids are going to start to realize that they have some control over whether they can hold it in or whether they can let it go. And that holding it in or releasing it could be pleasurable. Now, if the oral stage had breastfeeding as the sort of key action, then the anal stage has toilet training or potty training as its main function. So what Freud's going to say here is that if something goes wrong with potty training, whether it happens too early and it's too stressful or it happens too late and there weren't enough rules, that could have an impact on later adult personality. This would be an anal fixation, meaning that you're either anal expulsive or anal retentive. So somebody that's anal expulsive is messy, slovenly, maybe hostile or aggressive. They're just letting it all go, essentially. Whereas someone that's anal retentive or anal, sometimes you'll hear people say that, right? They're so, oh, that person's so anal. They usually mean that to be anal retentive. And that's someone that's very like stingy and conscientious and prudish and withholding. So you have anal expulsive, letting it all go, and you have anal retentive, holding it in. Okay, the next stage is the phallic stage. And it's at this stage between 3 to 6 years old that little boys and little girls realize that they have or don't have a penis. Phallic or phallus means penis. By way of the same-sex parent, according to Freud, the superego starts to develop in this stage. So breastfeeding for the oral stage, toilet training for the anal stage, and the discovery of genitals, essentially, for the phallic stage. At this stage, in the phallic stage, little boys realize that they have a penis and that girls don't. What Freud says here is that when little boys realize that girls don't have a penis and they do, they start to have castration anxiety. They start to worry about their penis being taken away. And Freud would say at the same stage, essentially girls start to have envy that they don't have a penis. So they have penis envy. During this stage, you're going to see the Oedipus complex, which is that little boys are going to have an attraction and a desire for their mother. They want to be close to their mother. But they see their dad as like a potential rival. But the dad is also stronger. And oh my gosh, they have castration anxiety, so they don't want anything to happen to their penis. So according to Freud, what's happening then is that since a little boy can't take on their dad, they can't like kill their dad and then marry their mom, what they do instead is they identify with the dad and get in the good graces of their dad and become just like their dad as a way to navigate those difficult feelings. And all of those feelings, those difficult feelings about mom and dad, Freud saw as important for the development of superego. That the superego developed by way of the same-sex parent identifying with the same-sex parent. Now you can see that the Oedipus complex is skewed towards boys. So in Freud's original theory, essentially the superego is more developed in boys than girls, because boys are able to develop the superego by identifying with their father. When they identify with their father, they are resolving some of their Oedipal anxiety. And they're also developing the same-sex parent attitudes or superego morality that they're going to need in later stages. A fixation at this stage, therefore, might have to do with sexual behaviors. So somebody that has some issues, mommy issues, daddy issues, is going to show potentially promiscuity or maybe immature sexual behavior, as well as vanity. A person that's fixated in the phallic stage and hasn't resolved some of these issues could become vain as a way to buffer their sense of anxiety over not being worth it enough. So if you've ever heard anybody referred to as a mama's boy or a ladies' man, then this is the fixation for the phallic stage. And if you've ever heard someone say that they have daddy issues, or you've heard this term daddy, right? This is absolutely a phallic stage fixation. So mama's boy or ladies' man or daddy issues, Freud might not have used those exact terms, but we owe him those ideas because those are the fixations of the phallic stage. In the next stage of psychosexual development, we have the latency stage. The latency stage is essentially a psychic or psyche, that's the psychological resources. It's a timeout. It's a timeout from all these deep things. And this lasts essentially from age 6 through to puberty, so we have some school time and some school age focus. And this timeout period is called latency because those sexual feelings and the sexual drives, they become latent or underneath or hidden. So what's latent here is the sexual drives. They go underneath. During this time, you'll see boys and girls pair up in like same-sex friendships. So it'll be like boys have cooties and girls are dumb, right? And so this barrier of time is a way of pushing down those drives and those desires. They become latent desires. They go underneath. The latency period, therefore, takes some of those sex drives and hides them gives them a timeout. And in our last stage of psychosexual development, we have the genital stage. And this stage is adolescence through to adulthood. It's at this time that there's a sexual reawakening and an awareness of the genitals. Those are the erogenous zones for this stage. And the source of pleasure here is actual sexual pleasure with another person. Now here's the thing. In this stage, the person has to take their affections and their romantic sexual feelings and place it somewhere other than their opposite sex parent. So their affections switch to outside people. Celebrities, rock stars, crushes, other people become the objects of sexual attraction, affection, and attention. All in all, what Freud is saying is that you only have so much psychic or psychological resources in every stage. You have a certain amount of energy that's invested in each of the stage's tasks, whether that's breastfeeding, toilet training, the discovery of the differences between boys and girls, school tasks, or dealing with crushes or romances. If there's some problem in one of these stages, a person could get fixed or fixated or locked into a certain stage. So for example, if you've ever heard somebody referred to as having a potty mouth or having potty humor or toilet humor, well, that could potentially be a fixation in the anal stage. Freud believed that a person could be stuck in one of the stages if a parent was too strict or too lax in that area, or if the main goal of that stage was not accomplished. So fixation occurs when a stage that you're stuck in starts to color or predominate or influence very largely your adult personality and adult behavior. The goal of psychoanalysis then is to uncover where some of those areas of getting stuck or fixated are to enable a person to move forward. So it should be fairly obvious that there are significant criticisms of psychodynamic theory and these approaches. One criticism is that it's putting way too much emphasis on sex and pleasure and instinct. Another criticism is that it's having too much focus on deep underlying parts of who you are. And to some degree, some critics think that it's relying too heavily on early experiences as being important for later action. Some critics would say that despite hard early experiences, many people are able to grow and still survive and thrive later through resilience and hardiness. But the main criticism and the best criticism here has to do with this theory cannot be tested. We do not have empirical proof of the Oedipal complex. We do not have a brain scan that shows the id. This theory does not have the empirical rigor that other theories that we're going to discuss in this lecture do. However, there are some contributions that we can't deny. First and foremost, we have to remember that some of these ideas are indeed limited by the time in which they were created. This doesn't give a pass to some of these ideas or some of these isms, but it does give an explanation to them. And in a lot of ways, the theory shows the psychology of the time, of people trying to understand their mind, body, and behavior, of people trying to understand the differences between men and women, and people trying to understand places in their life that they didn't quite understand. What are these places? Who am I? Why do I feel the way that I do? How do I deal with my anxiety? Freud and his contemporaries, because there's more than just Freud as part of this perspective, they should be credited with talking about the importance of childhood experiences. Children were not given a lot of time or value in society at this time, let alone psychology or medicine. So Freud talking about early experiences as being important to adulthood later, that is a really important idea, and he should be commended for that. Also, this discussion of stages of development, and not just little kids or just like adults, they're just younger. Stages of development is something else that is a very useful contribution, as is the role of the unconscious. I've also mentioned that the defense mechanisms, thank you, Anna Freud, that the defense mechanisms are something that we still research and have good data about in psychology. So the two big things that we can say actually do have some empirical basis are the existence of an unconscious and the operation of defense mechanisms. Some of the other contributions that I want to bring up before we go to the next perspective have to do with some of the people that are influenced by Freud and that were part of a psychodynamic perspective. Remember in chapter 9, we talked about Erik Erikson? Well, Erikson and his stages, those crisis stages throughout life, were influenced absolutely by Freudian theory. Another researcher by the name of Horney, she actually was a female psychoanalyst, and she really gave it back to Freud. She said, well, it's not just penis envy that's happening in that phallic stage. Boys also have womb envy. They're also envious of the fact that they can't have babies and they don't have a womb. So she's really influential because she had a perspective that involved discussing things like childhood security, attachment, and socio-cultural practices. In a clinical sense, we have Jung, and Jung was highly influenced by the psychodynamic perspective. And Jungian psychology has to do with this idea that it's not just the personal unconscious that's at play, but there's a bigger story or a collective unconscious that involves archetypes, heroes, demons, as people try to navigate their world, but they also have a universal understanding or memory as a species of some of those deep places. If you really want to find yourself at the intersection of psychology, like clinical psychology and philosophy, then go read some of the works of Jung about his archetypes. And another perspective has to do with Adler and Adler's idea of the inferiority complex. Adler was a psychodynamic theorist, and he didn't think that the sex drive was the main drive. He thought that people had a superiority drive, and that perfection and striving for superiority was the actual drive. So in his perspective, we have two big concepts that you've heard before: compensation and inferiority complex. So I bring all of those things up just to remind you that despite the fact that psychoanalysis and psychodynamic perspectives, in particular Freud, seem a little far-fetched, there are elements and features of some of these ideas that have led to psychological discoveries later. All right. So on the totally different end of the spectrum, we have a completely polar opposite perspective, and that is the humanistic perspective. So whereas psychoanalysis and psychodynamic approaches often saw the rougher and harder and deeper and darker sides of psychology, the humanists really want to focus on the positive aspects and the positive qualities of human existence. Humanistic perspectives often view humanity with a more optimistic or rosy lens, seeing people as capable of growth and positive characteristics. And the humanistic perspective in psychology, which we call the third force in psychology, the other two forces at the time would have been psychoanalysis as one and behaviorism as another. Humanistic psychology has to do with a focus on personal growth and positive human capabilities and characteristics. It's going to view a person not as a separated id, ego, superego type thing, but actually as a whole person with a positive potential. And that positive potential is going to have a lot to do with researching and understanding emotions and subjective experiences. And this perspective is going to respect and admire and want to support unique human capabilities, seeing people as valuable and talented and capable of learning. Now, although there might not be a lot of empirical research inside of humanistic psychology, it is absolutely a very, very prevalent perspective in clinical psychology. So a humanistic clinical psychologist is not going to ask you what's wrong with you. They're going to ask you what's going right for you. What are your strengths? What are your dreams? What are you capable of doing? One of the biggest names here, and a name that I'm sure you've seen before, has to do with Maslow, Abraham Maslow. Maslow was born in 1908. He died around 1970, and he had a huge influence on humanistic psychology. Maslow is the most well known for something called the hierarchy of needs. And you can understand that this is a perspective that's very useful in a clinical context. That hierarchy of needs has to do with a person has some basic needs that need to be met before the more specialized needs are fulfilled. So you need to have a safe place to sleep and eat before you can do your math homework or before you can become a talented architect. Maslow's perspective is that people were striving for personal growth, and they had a goal of becoming a more well-developed, positive person. Maslow's perspective was that people are capable of tremendous positive personal growth, that they strive to become better, that they strive for personal fulfillment, and they strive for something that he called the peak experience or self-actualization. And a person that is self-actualized is at their optimal human level, not just only of performance, but of their human existence and meaning and purpose. So a person that was self-actualized is not just powerful. They're not just happy. They're not just performing or having good grades or a lot of money or doing well in their career. They are doing what they've been made to do, what their meaning is, at a peak, full, alive level. One of the ways that Maslow came to these understandings of human psychology is that he did his work with some highly successful individuals. So he saw people that wanted to be fulfilled. He saw people that were willing to grow. He saw people that were willing to be tolerant and willing to set aside their prejudices and willing to be generous and willing to be compassionate and willing to achieve and willing to serve. So he has a rosy picture of humanity on account of seeing the very best of it. Another huge name in humanistic psychology is Carl Rogers. And Rogers is a contemporary of Maslow. They live and were alive around the same time. Rogers lived a little bit longer. He died in 1987. Rogers believed that all people are capable of growing, and they just need good conditions and support to be able to thrive. That support involves something called unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard has to do with consistent warmth, affection, love, and respect that's given from a person, an important person, to another person without any strings attached. It's unconditional. Whether you get an A or you get a B, you get my warmth, affection, love, and respect. Rogers believed that important people, caregivers, and mentors played a huge role in a person being able to grow and thrive. So how do we help people thrive, according to Rogers? Well, we need three things. We need unconditional positive regard, empathy, and being vulnerable and genuine. We can help other people by giving them these things. And you can see how unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness would be very supportive to the fulfillment of a person and their growth. So let's imagine the opposite of those things. Conditional positive regard means that I'm only nice to you when you do the things that I want you to do. So you only get my attention if you perform for me. Lack of empathy means that I don't care about your perspective, I can't take your perspective, I'm not going to listen to your perspective, and I'm not going to feel what you feel because my perspective is the one that matters. And the opposite of genuineness or vulnerability has to do with somebody being fake or inauthentic. So if I'm performing or I'm fake, you can't trust me. And trust is a foundation of human experience. So if you want to grow and you want to go to the next level of who you can be, you want to find people that give you unconditional positive regard, that they're genuine and truthful with you, and that they have the ability to connect to you and take your perspective and listen. Another really important concept from Rogers has to do with this idea of the development of self-concept. What Rogers said essentially is that we all have a real self and an ideal self. So the real self is who we really are right at that moment, strengths, weaknesses, and everything in between. And the ideal self is the self-actualized self, or the optimal self, the one that's at the peak of human fulfillment and purpose. And what Rogers is going to say is when the real self and the ideal self are well matched, they're matched up, then we're a fully functioning human being. We are coherent, we are integrated, we're at that optimal level of positive self-concept. As no surprise, Rogers thought that caregivers and parents and nurture from other people, emotional support, nurture, had a huge role in the development of the self. And that for many people, their caregivers give them this metric for what an ideal self should be. So nurture plays a role in the development of the self. I'm really intrigued by this idea about the match between your real self and your ideal self. And I can totally empathize how when the two of those things are very far apart from one another, you feel so unhappy. Think about people with depression or anxiety or eating disorders. They have a real self that's in one state, but then they have this ideal self which is like unachievable and they can't get there, and there is nothing but tension in this huge divide between where they are and where they want to be or where they feel they should be. What a prison to have that huge gap between who you are and who you idealize. What Rogers is going to say is that a huge gap between the real self and the ideal self, especially if the ideal self is something that's not even possible. If that ideal self is not even humanly possible, the person is going to be unhappy because there's no way that their real self can achieve that ideal status. There's no way that they'll be fulfilled or happy because they can never cross that divide. And part of therapy and mentorship and parenting and positive pro-social relationships has to do with people being able to take their real self and match it up to their realistic, purpose-filled, self-actualized ideal self. So tell me this, are you holding yourself to a standard that is achievable? Or is your ideal self something that's not even possible for a human being? If your ideal self is coming from Instagram or media or photoshopped pictures or movies, those are fiction, right? Those involve a lack of reality. So part of the process of healthiness to a humanist is bringing the real and the ideal into alignment. For most people, that involves their real self growing and their ideal self becoming more achievable, more realistic, more unique and specific to them. So what are some contributions of this perspective to psychology? Well, first and foremost, humanistic psychology has promoted and allowed us to study some more positive aspects of the human experience. If you look up positive psychology, you'll see studies of gratitude and happiness. And we owe a lot of that research and that focus to the humanistic perspectives. Humanistic perspectives are helpful to us because they focus on the importance of developing healthy self-concept and how self-perception and how you think of yourself is an important aspect to how your personality functions and develops. We appreciate that humanistic psychologists absolutely like to focus on the positive: growth, peak experiences, fulfillment, success, positive regard, empathy, genuineness, a whole person, a unique, wonderful, talented, full of potential person. And unlike their psychoanalytic counterparts, humanistic psychologists will focus on the conscious experience of being human. So we're not going on a deep dive underneath in the deep, deep, dark places of who we are. We are dealing with what we are presently mindful of and what is above the waterline and what we are apprehending and thinking about, feeling, experiencing right now. And that emphasis on conscious experience is very useful to the study of human behavior and mental processes. Some criticisms of the humanistic perspective have to do with the fact that there's not a lot of empirical research within this particular approach. Although this approach is very useful in clinical settings and within therapy or therapy settings, we don't do a lot of experiments in the humanistic perspective. So we don't have the data from empirical studies that we will in some of the other later perspectives. Now, another perspective there within that that's actually kind of a positive is that at the very least, the humanistic perspective has provided us with some new ideas about the positive aspects of human experience and human psychology. However, oftentimes critics will remark that the humanistic perspective might just be too optimistic about human nature. When we get to our next chapter about social psychology, you'll see that there's a lot of things that we do when we're together in groups that are not so great. So a criticism of humanistic perspectives is that it's almost like it sometimes doesn't acknowledge some of the darker places or some of the places that need help. Some people might criticize the humanistic perspective for being too narcissistic or focused on self. But those people I don't really think know enough about humanistic psychology to really have a fair criticism, because nowhere in what Maslow and Rogers have said have they said that narcissism is good. They're actually going to say that the highest form of a person, actually that person ends up doing good for others. That self-actualization often involves breaking down barriers and undoing prejudice and bringing justice to the oppressed and fulfilling a good, brave, amazing moral purpose. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that every perspective in personality psychology has things that are strong about it and things that might be potential weaknesses. But here's the cool thing. The science of psychology advances when multiple different perspectives test out their theories in an empirical setting. And this gives us information about which concepts are valid and reliable, and which concepts need to be edited, and which concepts are not accurate. So it's okay that we have different perspectives, because this is how science moves forward. All right, you guys, we've walked through 2 very foundational perspectives in personality psychology. You have completed part 1 of this lecture. Congratulations, very, very good. In part 2 of this lecture, we're going to talk about the other perspectives in personality psychology. Very good job. I'm proud of you. I'll catch you later for part 2.